a time before living memory, a great calamity befell a watery blue and green planet and peeled it apart. It now drifts through the stars, stretched wide and narrow, held taut, suspended between ruby and emerald moons. Its continents have become myriad islands, remote and distant from one another, divided by the saltwater graveyard known as the 10,000 Seas. Strange mutants, bizarre materials, and infinite mysteries are spread across the world that is now called the Stone Unfurled.
In the Korovokian Empire, there is a story about a great scientist named Constantine Huber who doubted the divinity of the Jade Queen. The Jade Queen herself was little help on this subject, for when the scientist was granted an audience with her and asked, she only responded,
"Divinity is not an adequate word to describe me, but for you it should suffice."
Frustrated, Huber vowed to prove or disprove her apparent goddesshood before he died. This seemed to amuse the Jade Queen. A woman made of light reflected in the surface of a massive crystal could appear amused, at least. She prophesied thus:
"You will not discover a thing about me in your final moments. You will discover a different truth, and it will kill you."
Countless jangling gold and silver moons and copper sickles poured away funding the expedition as Professor Huber sank every fortune and royalty from every invention and discovery of his for the sole purpose of digging boreholes to find other crystals like the one inhabited by Her Most Divine Majesty. His theory was that she was a material like any other. A wise, powerful, thinking material who was most certainly benevolent, of course. But then that meant that more of her would certainly be of great aid to the Empire. At some point, Huber had decided to move his research from the mainland out into the vast depths of the 10,000 Seas. Because of the way the sea floor seemed to charge certain stones with precious energy, he believed there must be some other beings like the Jade Queen beneath the sea who were doing this, perhaps as a sort of summons or cry for help. He devised an innovative new design for a diving bell, still used in the modern era, using a powerful braid of tubing and cables to not only hold the bell, but to transmit both air and messages between the sea floor and the surface. Huber and his research assistants dug borehole after borehole in the ocean floor. Years went by with no discoveries. One by one, the research assistants gave up and left while the money simply drained away. By the end of it all, Huber was only able to afford to keep a small ship and a skeleton crew with the royalties from his amazing diving bell. He would have his bell lowered every day, and he would dig and dig to no avail. At some point, he even stopped making new boreholes and settled on drilling his deepest. The dirt that came out of his borehole seemed to get colder and colder with each trip, and the professor believed he was nearing the core of the world, which he imagined to be made of golden ice like the walls that ran along its northern and southern edges. His messages to the surface became more regular and more manic as he continued to drill deeper and deeper. When the last order for the bell to be lowered was given, what little was left of the braid was pulled taut, and the ship listed heavily in the water. The broadcast from below was filled with the sound of whooshing, rushing air, as though Huber's bell had filled with the wind of 1,000 hurricanes. Huber's voice could be heard shouting over the wind as he cried, in a voice filled with revelatory ecstasy,
"Stars, Pure white stars on a jet black sky. It's the night sky.
And then the cable finally snapped, and Huber, as well as his final discovery, were lost, like so many other things, to the willful dispassion of the 10,000 seas. This is First Last Chance. Chapter 1. Spears of yellow, red, and orange fire climbed into the gentle green glow of the night sky, reflected in the shimmering water of the cold ocean, while the sea fort at Lost Pip's Rock burned to the slick and sticky rock formation that passed for the ground it stood on. There had not been much apparent about the structure that was conceivably flammable, as it had been mostly stone itself by any casual examination, and yet, somewhere during the landing of the invaders, some fire had broken out, and now flames gushed out of the slits of windows along the half-moon-shaped wall. A rattling of scattered gunfire occasionally broke out in pops and flashes along the parapets, but the great batteries mounted on the towers along the Great Wall were silent. They would likely remain so until the fire spread to the magazine and the whole place went up. For the moment, there was an eerie calm spreading over the compound where in previous hours it had been chaos and carnage. From the high tower peering over the rocky sickle islet at the center of the sea fort, all of this could be seen very well through the broad picture window in the governor's office. Not that the governor himself was paying any attention. Instead, he was just hunched over his grand mahogany desk while the island's coxswain explained to him, ranting with both fists pounding on the heavy wooden surface, how all of this was his fault. The irate screaming of a doomed, desperate man resounded so well within the office that it vibrated the gilt placards on the wall depicting the numerous rewards that had done nothing to prepare the young governor for just how immensely he would fail his station. And still, the governor said nothing, electing instead to continue looking down at the stubby crystal glass full of rum centered beneath his tented elbows. Piles of wavy raven hair spilled over the shoulders of his brocaded gold-on-gray frock coat, while his somewhat hooded emerald eyes stared straight down into the amber surface of the liquid, which itself was also rippling slightly in tune to the beat of the coxswain's frantic shouting.
Gave you every warning and every chance to send a requisition order for more boats.
Screamed the older man in the tattered sea-green Imperial Navy uniform tunic.
Every opportunity to request assistance from the fleets, every bleeding shot in the world to ask any passing Clanarch for assistance. And what do you do? What do, you little snot?
The governor did not say what he had done, but he knew very well that his coxswain would tell him.
You pissed away your time and mine chasing expensive trash, courting the toffs of the surrounding islands, and shagging your blonde hussy on that expensive yacht of yours,
explained the coxswain, eyes bulging and mouth snarling, though what he said next caused his face to transmute at least into something of a cruel smile.
At least I get to die with a little bit of satisfaction, your goddess-damned excellency, knowing that your little golden-haired cunt loaded up all your blinking treasure into that stupid fool yacht of yours and scarpered at the first sign of guilders on the horizon. You rat! You spoiled, knobby little gobshite!
The governor continued enduring the abuse in the same pose. A bead of sweat rolled down the end of his long, straight nose and trembled before dripping into the rum. The fire was getting closer. It wasn't as though he hadn't tried informing government. Sure, it hadn't been a constant preoccupation, but it wasn't as though he'd known that inaction would lead to a full-on raid. Of course, none of this would likely calm down the coxswain, and it certainly wouldn't save their miserable lives.
Honestly, you really are, and have been, the absolute worst this whole time. It astounds me, your blinking honour, how you are supposedly from a great clan, and yet you seem no different from the limiter scum I would likely be ferrying around even now if I had the good sense to give up my commission after my last cruise. An easy land post this was indeed, you silly bugger.
Growled and wheezed the coxswain, now nearly exhausted from his ranting tirade.
8 months of your foppish dandy-gall, your strutting around and cracking jokes, your absolute flippant disregard for the duties of your office, and your complete and utter incompetence has driven me to want my brains blown out.
The coxswain stopped shouting at last to catch his breath. He stared down at the mess of hair sweating behind the desk, the limp, lanky form of the governor framed by the flames of his burning domain in the window behind him. He was about to say something else, but before he could speak again, somebody gave him his wish. The double doors just behind the coxswain burst open, and a trio of men in brown tricorns and powder-blue boat cloaks dashed into the room with pistols and cutlasses in their hands. Without even waiting for the coxswain to turn around, the first among them fired into the back of his head at almost point-blank range. A spatter of pink and red flowered along the frame of the window on the other side of the desk, and another joined it on the corner of the desk as the fresh corpse thumped into it on its way down. The governor had jumped when the shot rang out, but still remained numbly silent to the murder of the man who had been in charge of the Seafort's boats, before these blue-coated men had hunted and sunk them in the weeks preceding this landing. Slowly and stupidly, the young man in the chair turned his head up to look over the intruders. At first glance, they could have been mistaken as identical triplets, but this was mainly due to the fact that each man had painted his face pale white with an exaggerated pink cherubic blush upon the cheeks, and then donned a fabulous court wig of spun golden thread and wire beneath felt tricorn hats. The truth showed at the edges of their face, where one man had chestnut brown skin, while the other two were a few shades closer to their makeup powder. The one who'd put the coxswain out of his misery flicked the lever on the back of his pistol, and the barrel tipped forward for him to slide in another translucent onion paper cartridge from a bandolier over his shoulder, while he asked, politely, "Are you His Most Imperial Excellency, Governor of Lost Pips Rock, 39th in line Erator of Clan Harridan, Arlo Harridan Harkon?" The young man with so many titles sat still mute, still numb, staring the ridiculous man down with a look of utter stupidity. One of the others muttered, "That's got to be him, Sarge. Caramel complexion, long nose, raven hair, green eyes, long but slight." The first man nodded, but then gestured to the third of them. "Davro, you won the auction. You do the honors." A chestnut brown-skinned hand rose to remove the tricorn hat, and the wig came with it, revealing a close-cropped afro beneath as the man introduced himself.
"Greetings, Your Excellency. I'm Lance Corporal Davro Rawlins. I'm representing the 29th Free Marines Regiment and the Guild of Sovereign Seafarers. I was the highest bidder in an auction for the right to negotiate your surrender, sir. It's a great honor to meet you."
With this said, Davro replaced his hat and pointed his pistol at Arlo before continuing,
"Allow me to make my initial offer. Surrender or die."
And yet, still, Arlo sat in his chair and said nothing. A long, awkward silence passed before the man who'd muttered before coughed and suggested in a similar low tone,
"Which I think maybe he's catatonic or something, Dav. Shall I carry him?"
All three men started and nearly filled the young governor with holes when he suddenly moved to wrap his fingers around the base of his glass and down 4 good gulps of rum in one draught poured down the back of his open throat. When the glass was empty, he reached for the decanter heedless to the fresh blood oozing from one side of it and poured another glass of rum while the men in blue coats watched somewhat awkwardly. In what was becoming something of a macabre custom for new visitors to the office, the skull of the first one burst open as someone shot into it from behind. The other 2 men whirled towards the door just in time to be skewered by cutlasses and boarding pikes from the squad of 5 greencoats from the local garrison who'd swarmed up the stairs to the office an instant before. The Imperial soldiers were much more competent than the guild men they'd just dispatched, piling into the office with revolvers at high ready and instantly seeking defensible positions behind the fine velvet sofas and heavy reading lecterns. A big man with a bandage around his left arm gave a shoulder check to knock a bookcase onto its side before taking a seat behind it so he could unsling and load a shotgun he'd carried into the room. Leading this band of defenders was an enormous, ugly, and muscular woman of some 55 years, with her skin tanned to leather from years marching along the walls of the sea fort. It was due to her these men were on their best behavior. After all, this woman was the commanding officer for the pitiable little garrison of men who occupied the island. She smiled wide when she saw Arlo behind the desk and practically pranced around it to get to him.
"Your Excellency,"
she cheered, wrapping her arms around him.
"I'm so glad you're safe, my little bird."
Arlo looked up at the woman just as stupidly as he'd looked up at the guilders before her. Unlike them or the coxswain they'd dispatched before, this older woman had nothing but benevolence for the young man before her, and petted down his hair while speaking to him with an affectionate and matronly voice.
"Come up from your chair, little bird. Let us get you away from here."
First, Arlo drank again. Then, he finally spoke at last. The croak that passed for his voice revealed that at some point in the night, he'd been crying. "Major Gromlaw, I'm sorry to tell you. Mr. Lately explained to me that there are no boats left before his—" Arlo looked down, not at the corpse of Jonah Lately, but the red and pink smear it had left on the corner of his desk. "His rather untimely demise." The Major petted Arlo more and hugged him to her chest, which may not have even been comfortable without the armor plate crushing him. Though Arlo said nothing else, she still made shushing noises as though he had, before explaining.
"It's the Havenites, sir. We gave them the key to the larder and a spare room in exchange they would wait for you. But we must go. They will not wait forever."
Arlo unsteadily rose to his feet, blinking away confusion in light of this revelation. It wasn't that he minded being saved, but the older woman's doting behavior was starting to feel unusual. Once he was on his feet, she pressed both of her hands on the side of his head and pulled him into a deep, passionate kiss that seemed to suck Arlo out of his detached stupor. His eyes bulged, but he still managed to give the woman an awkward pat on the back while he waited for her to release him. He couldn't tell as much rum as he'd had in his mouth recently, but supposed that perhaps the Havenites hadn't been the only ones in the spirit room. When she finally seemed to have her fill, Major Gromlaw leaned back and apologized.
"I'm sorry, little bird, but I have been madly in love with you since the day you first arrived here. Last year, I just couldn't let you go without telling you, sir. Please, let's go now."
Arlo found himself bashfully looking down at the toes of his tall, cuffed boots. The soldiers who'd come into the room with Gromlaw seemed to all be studiously not looking at either of them, though he could see that at least one of them was embarrassed to be in the room from how quickly he averted his eyes even further when Arlo glanced his way. "This continues to be the most eventful day of my life," was all Arlo could manage as he yanked open the center drawer of his desk to grab his revolver and whatever few coins he could lay hand to. Havenites didn't allow money on their ships, to his knowledge, but he doubted they would search him considering the circumstances. Gromlaw held his frock coat while he stuffed silverware into the pockets of his matching waistcoat, and one of her men wordlessly helped him put on his garrison belt and the ornate little spadroon he'd been given as a badge of office. Arlo much preferred the weight of the sword he'd trained with at university, but it had been aboard his yacht with everything else of any value, which meant it was now leagues away and in the care of a woman he was beginning to suspect had never loved him. The woman who actually loved him gave a few sharp orders to her men in the room, and they obeyed with mechanical alacrity to escort the governor out of his office and onto the walkway along the top of the sea fort. The 7 of them crept along the parapets towards the southern tip of the quay with the sound of roaring fire as white noise in their ears. Gunfire wasn't crackling along the length of the island anymore, and as their boots all padded along the cobblestone walkway, Arlo began to suspect they were the last people alive in the sea fort. Behind them, there was a grating noise as the ground they had just been walking on gave way not a full second after they'd stepped off it. A cascade of embers belched up into the night sky, and were then quickly gobbled up in an obscuring pillar of black smoke that ushered the group onwards at an even quicker pace. Arlo nervously peered at the gaping hole behind them and then swung his head back, only to stop halfway as his eye refused to see the sea to his right. He froze in place, even as he felt a firm palm against his back from one of the troopers behind him trying to usher him onwards. The water was choppy on one side of something, reflecting the green glow of the sky above. The water was choppy on the other side of that something, reflecting the orange light of the burning sea fort. In the middle was a gray wedge of a shadow gliding towards them. Arlo spent a few seconds blinking at it, until at last some part of his eyesight adjusted and a few dark shapes came into focus. The cross trees of an unrigged mast were peering out from behind a tall funnel stack, and a conning tower studded with gleaming observation windows, not to mention a massive swooping arch of cold steel not a stone's throw away. The disapproving glare of a nude woman, rendered in brass with arms spread behind her, loomed above him as suddenly, intensely, and gut-wrenchingly Arlo was aware that he was looking at the oncoming prow of a guild destroyer. At first, he only managed a yelp, but thankfully he was able to hop up and down a little, and this seemed to jar loose the words, "They're coming right for us! Run!" His voice must have alerted some men on the deck of the approaching ship, for no sooner did their feet start pounding the flagstones than did a shower of gunfire begin to rain down from the deck above them. They couldn't have crossed 10 paces before a stray round caught a man in the side, and he dragged a heel while clutching his kidney as he smashed into a parapet and then tumbled a story down into the sea below. Arlo could hear the stricken man's arms tearing at the surface of the water until the noise was completely drowned out by the grinding of the destroyer's hull against the rocky sea floor next to the island. Just in case he wasn't entirely sure the Guilders were lunatics, the brass band on the deck of the destroyer began to play a jolly little tune while the men aboard took more pot shots at the running figures below them. On top of that, Arlo could swear he heard some of the Guilders cheering him on from back there. "Go, little people, go! Run, little Imperials! Ha!" The motley little gaggle of soldiers dashed around a corner, and they could see the lopsided shape of 2 raked masts on a tall ship moored at the bottom of a set of stairs directly ahead of them. They were within hailing distance of it, and in fact Gromlaw had raised her voice to shout,
"The ship! Ahoy!"
Only there was no way anybody was going to hear anything, because at that instant the guild destroyer spoke with a single gun. It was a heart-stopping thwomp, and a great fireball that lit up the silhouette of the grounded warship in the bay. Even at full depression, the gun was nested too deeply in its sponson to hit them, so they were just treated to a shrill screech as the shell tore overhead and blasted a hole in the surface of the water far out of sight. Nonetheless, the few crew members of the Haven who'd been still aground instantly surged back onto their ship and began to hastily make preparations for weighing anchor. By the time they reached the dock, there was already a slowly growing gap between the little ship and the wall it had been moored against. Arlo started sprinting for the brig even more furiously when he saw the gold wigs of more guilders emerging from the opposite end of the dock. They saw him and his approaching cohort as well, and emptied their pistols at them before charging ahead. To his right, a bark of a shotgun cracked before the man who fired it fell, and one other of the soldiers stumbled and ate flagstones, though Arlo had no idea if he had been hit or just tripped. Arlo tore the spadroon from its sheath as he, Gromlaw, and the surviving men clashed with the guilders. Beside him, Gromlaw crushed a guilder with her boarding pike before pistoling a man behind him with her revolver. Arlo hadn't even drawn his revolver, but by some miracle his sparring instincts took over when he crossed swords with his opponent. He'd never swung a sword with sincere intent to cause harm before, but on some automatic signal he found himself catching his opponent's blade with the dull side of his sword and instantly flicking the true edge to slash at the guilder's thigh. A fan of red blood stained his opponent's blue coat, and Arlo immediately pushed the point of his sword into the man's middle with an anguished expression of apologetic revulsion. He leaned away from the falling body to avoid getting blood on his beautiful coat, but the movement had also saved him from getting shot through the head by a guilder who didn't lean away in time to avoid the same fate from Gromlaw. All the while, the Haven ship was drifting further away from the dock. If it hadn't been so high in the water, it would have needed a gangway that would have fallen into the water long ago, and they'd be stranded. As it was, the little brig had been almost right against the wall of the sea fort, and there was still a chance to leap across the gap. Gromlaw jammed her boarding pike into another guilder and this time left it in the man so she could seize Arlo by the arm and drag him to the wall. She cast one quick glance over her shoulder to the melee behind her before planting another passionate kiss on the young man's face.
"You were always such a pretty little man, my little bird,"
she said while the fire roared. The men shouted and steel met steel. Gromlaw looked deep into Arlo's green eyes and sighed before declaring,
"Don't forget me. Never forget what this old soldier gave for just one last kiss."
And then she hurled him bodily across the gap onto the deck of the Havenite ship. For his part, Arlo could only just feel baffled. The deck came up fast and knocked the wind out of him, but the former governor of Lost Pip's Rock still made the effort to crawl to the taffrail. He heaved himself onto it with his sword still clutched in one hand and gazed back across the gap to the woman looking down at him. Her shrinking face seemed so loving, so sincere. He gaped at her, this woman who, before tonight, had practically been a stranger to him. Sure, she'd always been sweet, always looked at him a certain way. The little bird thing was not new either. But this petting, this kissing, this business of sacrificing everything to save his life, there was nothing Arlo could think of to say. The entire day had been a surreal procession of one impossibility after another. He turned to look over his shoulder at the destroyer beached in the bay. He let his sweeping gaze take in the rapidly degrading orange glow of the burning sea fort. He looked down at his hand, still clutching the ornate sword whose blade was sticky with blood. Draped against the taffrail, he let his head list slightly while he tried to summon the willpower to do anything. Another gun on the destroyer's side spoke up and blasted some distant water while the Havenites clambered up into the rigging to prepare spreading more canvas, ignoring the well-dressed young man while they rushed along to escape the island. Arlo just stared out at the fire, even as the island grew smaller and smaller. When the magazine finally went up, the resulting explosion lit up the sky and drowned out the green glow of the moon. Arlo finally let himself cry again when it happened. knowing that there was nothing left standing, and nobody left alive, of the little imperial outpost that he'd been given to take care of. He didn't sob like he had when he found out that his lover Valentina had taken his yacht and left him behind, but he just stared out at the ever more distant flames while tears streamed down his cheeks. The Havenites said nothing to him, asked nothing of him. They left him so completely to himself that they didn't even bother him when he slumped over onto his side and went to sleep right there on the deck, still caked with blood and soot, drifting off to sleep with dim thoughts filling his mind. It was his first kiss with an older woman. It was his first time killing another person. It was his first time being shot at. It was his first time traveling on a boat powered by wind instead of some kind of engine. It was the end of his first real, loving relationship, and maybe his second. It was the end of his first real job. It was the end of the longest and most impossible day he had ever lived.
First Last Chance was written by B.E. Lunatois and is narrated by the author. The effect of some characters' voices is achieved using 11 Labs speech-to-speech voice changer software. All Foley and soundscapes were created from audio in the public domain or released under a Creative Commons Zero license. Lastly, and most importantly, thank you for listening or reading.